Hearings are required for any initiatives that qualify, and I'm delighted to be joined by my Public Safety Senate Chair, Senator Mark Leno, and we are anticipating some other members of the Public Safety Committee of both houses will be in attendance during the hearing. I want to explain a few things to you. We had an informational hearing. The Assembly Public Safety Committee had an informational hearing on the legalization of marijuana, on my legislation. At that time, it was 390. Currently, we had to reintroduce that with a different number. And this morning, I put across the desk of the legislative analyst AB X69, which is the new legislation with new language anticipating the passage of Prop 19. And we'll know about that outcome, of course, in a matter of a few weeks. We also had a committee hearing on my legislation 390, and it was passed out of committee, had to be reintroduced due to deadlines, etc. So I don't think what we hear today will be anything too new. Always there's a spirit of civility around these issues that tend to be controversial. Let me give you a few landmarks about how the committee meeting is going to be held, and then I would like to ask my colleague, Senator Leno, for any remarks. There'll be 4 panels for discussion. First, the Legislative Analyst Office will address the costs and savings to the state, which would be expected should Prop 19 be approved by voters this fall. The second panel will address the effect legalized marijuana might have on the criminal justice system, including the rates of arrest, prosecution, and detention on both the local and state level for possession and or sales of marijuana in general law enforcement resources devoted to combat marijuana possession, cultivation, and sales. I think it's important to explain here that in past hearings we have already explored many questions as to whether the legalization of marijuana is constitutional. Given the short time frame, I'd like to avoid repetition of the past Assembly Public Safety hearing on constitutional issues and would like to focus on arguments that these committees might not yet have heard. I would also like to make the distinction that the legislature enacts laws and the courts interpret those laws. The legislature is not the proper forum to litigate. Having said that, I do think it is important to identify the obvious arguments and hear testimony on how those arguments might affect the success of this initiative. Third will be a discussion about the effect Prop 19 will have on the cities and counties. And the final panel, before we open things up for public comment, will examine what role the legalization of marijuana plays in crafting an effective and humane drug policy. I do want to mention that we're not going to devote too much time to any of the health issues in and around marijuana. I feel that that's a discussion more fitting for the Committee on Health. And the Economist on September 26, 2009 joined the call for an honest policy debate regarding legalization. In January, the City Council of El Paso, Texas passed a resolution expressing support for its neighbors to the south, Ciudad Juarez, which has become one of the bloodiest epicenters in the Mexican violent drug trade because of its proximity to the United States. The article goes on to question how America's war on drugs has contributed to the violence on both sides of this border, and one city council member hoped that the resolution would spark an honest, open national debate on ending the prohibition. Although this debate may be perceived as politically inconvenient and controversial, as I mentioned, a civil and educated debate is critical to creating effective and lasting public policy. Whether Proposition 19 passes or fails in November, this is an issue that is not going away. The more information we as a legislature can gather, the better choices we can make for our constituents. And I would like very much now to introduce and ask Senator Leno if he would like to make any opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Amiano, for your introduction and for your staff's assistance in pulling this hearing together, which is pursuant to Elections Code 9034. and also for your leadership on this issue for many years now. Thanks to Kim Horiuchi and to Sue Hyland from the Assembly Public Safety Committee and Jerry McGuire of our staff. And then, of course, thanks to all the witnesses who have traveled distances to offer testimony today. And when you do speak, if you could please state your name and your affiliation for the record of the committee. I just want to add a few historical perspectives, given that we are talking about a period of prohibition relative to marijuana in this country over the past number of decades. It was in the earlier part of the 20th century when the United States first started to, by state and then federally, pass laws limiting the use of different drugs. And it's curious to note that oftentimes the spark behind those legal initiatives had a tinge of xenophobia to them, referring back to the first opiate laws, which were to control opium, were targeted at Chinese immigrants who smoked opium. This was around 1919. Southwestern states in this country started to pass marijuana prohibitions based, as legislative testimony establishes, on fear of Mexican immigrants. In Utah, there were Mormons returning to Utah from Mexico who had initially fled the polygamy ban in Utah and, of course, learned to smoke marijuana in Mexico. And then in Colorado, there were allegations that Mexican immigrants committed crimes while under the influence of marijuana. And we're well familiar with the Hearst papers' Mexican scares of that time and subsequent reefer madness that was captured on film. By 1927, New York and other northeastern states banned marijuana. The idea was that marijuana might be used as a substitute for alcohol during the alcohol prohibition years, starting in 1919 as a result of Constitutional Amendment 18. And then by 1937, the federal government passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which did not outlaw marijuana, but placed such a tax on it that would make it prohibitive for farmers to grow, which also then included industrial hemp, which is a related subject matter. As a result of the federal Marijuana Tax Act, all transactions and persons involved in transactions had to be recorded and the record maintained for inspection. That violation of law was a crime. Interesting to note, the American Medical Association opposed the Marijuana Tax Act because they were concerned at the medical use of marijuana would be curtailed as a result of the Marijuana Tax Act, and they were concerned for that because of their conviction of the medical benefits of marijuana. They also argued that there was no evidence of marijuana addiction, and the AMA also argued that there was no evidence of prisoners who committed crimes because of marijuana. So we come full circle to 1996 in California when the voters approved the compassionate use of marijuana through Prop 215. At least 10 other states have followed, all by voter-approved initiatives. And here we are today to hear another considered voter initiative to finally end this prohibition on marijuana. And I just want to quote Daniel Okrent, who is the author of a new book on prohibition of the 20th century, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition. This is relative to alcohol. His quote is, "In almost every respect imaginable, prohibition was a failure. It encouraged criminality and institutionalized hypocrisy. It deprived the government of revenue, stripped the gears of the political system, and proposed profound limitations on individual rights." I hope that we can consider Prop 19 today in light of those comments. And with that, Mr. Chair, we'll begin the hearing.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the edifying history. Thinking of Big Love, on I also want to acknowledge the staff of the Senate Public Safety Committee for all their help. And so without ado, and I'm going to really want to stick to our time limits here. I hope that we'll be out by 11:30. I will ask at the end how many people we have for public comment, and that'll determine the length of time, either a minute or 2 minutes. We'll see what happens. So our very first presentation is Paul Golowski from the LAO's office, Legislative Analyst's Office. Good morning. And we have you down for about a 15-minute presentation within reason.
Thanks. Paul Golowski with the Legislative Analyst's Office. The Sergeant distributed a handout to you earlier from which I'll be speaking. The information in this handout is largely drawn from the analysis of the measure that we did for the voter guide. Our office is statutorily charged with preparing a analysis of each initiative measure for the voter guide. We do not take positions for or against initiative measures. Our job is simply to try to describe the measure and its fiscal effects for the voters. If you turn to the first page of the handout, it describes current marijuana laws and regulations. I won't go into it in great detail since Senator Leno just presented much of the information, but perhaps the biggest point here is that marijuana is illegal under federal law. It's generally illegal under state law as well, except under Proposition 215, which was passed by the voters in 1996. Marijuana cultivation and possession are allowed for medical purposes. Now, this has obviously set up a conflict between state and federal law. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could continue to enforce its own laws against marijuana in California. However, last year in 2009, the current administration decided that it would not prosecute medical marijuana patients and providers in California. If you turn to the second page of the handout, I'll go over the major provisions of Proposition 19. There's really, you can think about it with having two major parts. The first has to do with personal consumption of marijuana, and the second with commercial marijuana. With respect to personal consumption of marijuana, Proposition 19 would allow persons aged 21 or older to possess, process, share, or transport up to 1 ounce of marijuana. And it would also allow persons 21 or older to cultivate marijuana in an area up to 25 square feet. Now, the measure does also allow the state or local governments to increase this 1 ounce threshold or this 25 square foot threshold. So individual cities and counties could increase it, or the legislature could increase it on a statewide basis. Consumption of marijuana would only be permitted in residences or in licensed premises, which I'll talk about later, or other non-public places. Consumption of marijuana would not be allowed in public under the measure. Proposition 19 also contains some language saying that individuals could not be punished, fined, or discriminated against for using marijuana in accordance with the measure. But it does say that employers would retain their existing rights to address consumption of marijuana that impairs an employee's job performance. Moreover, the measure also specifies that existing laws that prohibit driving under the influence of drugs would not be changed. And it also says that existing laws that prohibit possessing marijuana on school grounds would also not be changed. And as I mentioned, the second part of the measure has to do with commercial marijuana activities. And what Proposition 19 does is it allows local governments, if they choose, they could authorize and regulate marijuana cultivation, processing, distribution, transportation, and sales for commercial purposes. It also would allow the state to do this on a statewide basis if it chose to. Local governments could impose new taxes on marijuana, benefit assessments and fees, licensing fees in order to raise revenue or to offset costs associated with regulation. And the measure would also allow the state to impose new taxes as well. If you turn to page 3 of the handout, we'll start to discuss our assessment of the fiscal effects. And one of the major points that we would make to the voters in looking at this measure is that there's a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if Proposition 19 were to pass. And there's really two primary reasons for that. The first reason, as I mentioned, is that the measure allows the state or local governments to take certain actions. It allows local governments, if they want to authorize commercial marijuana sales or to impose new taxes, but it doesn't require local governments to do this. So it's sort of an opt-in system. And we don't know how many local governments would choose to do this, any or how many, so that makes it very difficult to sort of envision what would happen if the proposition passed.
Yeah, let me interrupt, because that is something I was going to ask you, and you are embracing that. Given how much the initiative is directed at the discretion of local governments, so calculating the cost to both state and local governments, do you imagine the largest savings might be the criminal justice system in terms of?
Yeah, I'll discuss in a moment the actual fiscal effects, a lot of which are sort of contingent on there being a commercial marijuana market that develops, particularly with the revenues. If the local governments don't authorize commercial sales, then there wouldn't be any additional tax revenue. You know, in terms of the law enforcement and criminal justice costs, the measure does legalize possession of 1 ounce of marijuana, which currently is a misdemeanor in California. So those sorts of crimes definitely would not be crimes if the measure passed. But a lot of the other fiscal effects are dependent on what state and local governments choose to do in terms of regulation and taxation.
Mr. Chair, I've got a question on that point. As you pointed out, this is permissive, doesn't require anything of the state or of local governments. If local governments, well, irrespective of what local governments may or may not do, the state legislature could, by a simple majority vote, proceed to do what any of the local governments could do.
Correct. The state, there is language in the measure that allows the legislature to amend the measure. So the state could, on a statewide basis, decide to enact regulations of commercial marijuana activities. So we don't know. It could end up being a statewide system if the legislature went in that direction, or it could be sort of an individual city-by-city, county-by-county system.
And amendments to Prop 19, as you said, can be passed by the legislature, and that's a simple majority, 2/3 vote.
Correct, majority vote.
Majority vote. Thanks.
The next point that creates a lot of sort of uncertainty in talking about the measure is that we don't know what the federal government would do if Proposition 19 were to pass. As I mentioned, the federal government is currently not enforcing laws against marijuana that are in compliance with state medical marijuana laws, but we don't know what would happen if Proposition 19 were to pass and to allow marijuana for non-medical purposes. For many years after Proposition 215 passed, the federal government continued to enforce its own laws. And if the federal government were to continue to do this, it would obviously impede the development of a commercial market for marijuana in California. But again, that creates another sort of unknown in looking at this measure. If you turn to page 4, I'll talk about some of the specific potential effects on expenditures and on revenues. The first that could occur is a reduction in state and local correctional costs. As I mentioned, marijuana is generally illegal in California currently. If the measure were to pass and were to legalize various marijuana activities, it could reduce the number of offenders in state prison and county jail, on probation, on parole. The magnitude of this could be several tens of millions of dollars. The second effect on the criminal justice system could be a reduction in court and local law enforcement costs. So if there were fewer arrests occurring for marijuana and fewer court cases, that could lead to savings in those areas. However, it's likely in terms of the courts and local law enforcement that these resources would be directed elsewhere. So for example, right now in the court system, there's a long waiting time for cases. And so if there are fewer marijuana cases, it might mean maybe there's less of a waiting time for other cases, but it might not result in actual budgetary savings. And lastly, there could be fiscal effects on other state and local government programs, particularly in the health area. There could be, if there was an increase in consumption in marijuana as a result of the measure, this could increase demand for certain publicly funded substance abuse treatment programs. It's difficult to sort of predict how much. Relatively speaking, the magnitude would probably be less than what the criminal justice expenditures are, just because the programs are so smaller.
Did you factor in the cost of potential litigation on any?
We didn't, in our analysis, we didn't specifically look at any litigation resulting from the measure, but that could be another cost that the state would incur. If you turn to page 5 of the handout, I'll talk about some of the potential revenues resulting from the measure. First, there could be, again, this is assuming that there is a commercial marijuana activity that develops, which is a big unknown. But there could be revenue from existing taxes. So businesses cultivating or selling marijuana would be subject to the same taxes as other businesses, such as the sales tax. Secondly, there could be new revenues from any new taxes or new fees that state or local governments imposed. A portion of these revenues would likely support any new regulatory costs that the state or local governments would incur to regulate marijuana. It's difficult to predict the magnitude of these revenues. Since marijuana is illegal, we don't have a lot of very good data about consumption and price and what would happen if marijuana were legalized. And what Proposition 19 would do is really different than what's been done anywhere else in the world. But we did...
Anywhere else in the country?
Anywhere in the country or anywhere. Marijuana hasn't been legalized to this extent.
In the universe, we don't.
Yeah. So it's very difficult to know what would happen to consumption and to price. However, we did try to make various assumptions, on consumption and on price and what would happen. And the likely range, if a commercial market were to develop in marijuana, we feel would be probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually in revenues each year. And
question for you. We often hear and read that California's largest crop is marijuana, and I've seen or heard different estimates of $4 or $5 billion. $14 billion industry. Do you know how those numbers are put together?
I think some of those numbers are estimates based on how much has been seized by law enforcement, and then they try to
extrapolate.
Exactly. There's two ways you can try to estimate the market. One is that way, and one is looking at the consumption side. There's surveys that the federal government does of drug use in each state, and you can try to look at how much people are reporting of consuming marijuana and then extrapolate from there to get the size of the market as well.
For example, 40% of Californians smoke marijuana, so you can then calculate to 14 billion.
Yeah, they break it out, how many have smoked in the past year, in the past month, in the past...
Also, the Betty Yee, our president of the Board of Equalization, has been doing some focus groups and extrapolating information, which leads me, do you think the initiative might have a dual tax structure? Some funds to local government, some funds to state government, especially the excise tax?
It would depend on what happened if the measure passed. I believe with the current sales tax, a portion goes to state government and a portion to local government. So right there would be sort of a dual structure. But it would depend if the regulation occurred mostly at the local level. It might be more of a local tax if it occurred more at the state level.
We're going to have to wrap up. But just one more question, and then whatever my colleague needs to ask. Do you imagine you postulated that we might lose some federal funds, but would that also be a product of the cost saving, the cost benefit analysis?
We actually didn't. Which federal funds?
Well, you were postulating that there might be some federal funds we wouldn't qualify for if the legalization happened, substance abuse funds or.
I was saying that there's certain, they are partially federally funded health programs for which the demand could potentially increase for that, and the state is responsible for a portion of those costs, and they are entitlement programs, so we would have to pay for any increase in those programs.
Thank you.
A portion.
Senator, any?
That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. And I'd like to bring up our next panel. And this is about Prop 19 in the criminal justice system. Jan Scully, District Attorney, County of Sacramento. Pete Dunbar, Chief of Police, Pleasant Hill. William Cox, former Sergeant, Los Angeles Police Department. And Kelly Evans, Associate Director, American Civil Liberties Union, Northern California. What about Karen England? That's only going to help you. So. Well, it's so in here for me. They put my picture in news. Just so you guys know. Okay. Okay, good morning. And each of you have approximately 5 minutes to make the presentation. We're going to keep that rule throughout the panel presentations. And Ms. Scully, if you would like to start. Sure, Mr. Dunbar. My pleasure.
Your first responders.
Very important, especially with the PG&E catastrophe that happened. So.
Well, good morning, Chairs Leno and Amiano and members of the Public Safety Committees. My name is Pete Dunbar. I'm currently the Chief of Police with the Pleasant Hill Police Department, suburb of Concord. I've been the chief for 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was with the Oakland Police Department for just under 24 years, serving as a deputy chief for 5 years. So I've had experience in suburbia and also in a larger city. First of all, as you've heard, possession of marijuana is a violation of federal law. It conflicts with the role of law enforcement and the employer and drug-free workplace issues, which someone will talk about later. Interestingly enough, for someone who's growing or selling marijuana and admits to being a drug dealer and being taxed, that opens himself up to federal prosecution. Candidly, I'll admit that the current administration may not be keen on prosecuting people for the sales of marijuana, but should that change, that will also change. Yesterday, I visited the splash page of the Yes on 19 website, and there are 3 main components that they base their argument on. First is it will control cannabis like alcohol. Secondly, put our police priorities where they belong. And third, generate billions of dollars in revenue. I'd like to talk about each of those points as it relates to public safety. Controlling cannabis like alcohol does not occur with this proposition. 478 cities and counties will decide if they want to opt in and regulate sales and receive revenue. There is no overall state regulation and control that exists today like the Alcohol Beverage and Control, or ABC for alcohol regulation. It would be independent regulation for those cities and counties that opt in. Also, with alcohol, it's clear that when someone is driving under the influence of alcohol has a blood alcohol content of 0.08 or greater, they're considered to be driving under the influence of alcohol. There is no such medical statute existing for marijuana and none proposed in this ballot measure. Without a doubt, passage of this proposition will lead to more usage because there will be more marijuana available and an increase in drug driving. In 1996, as you mentioned earlier, the Compassionate User Act was passed, and a number of dispensaries came up. And I was in Oakland at the time, and I can't tell you the number of dispensaries that sprouted up quickly and without any regulation. And when the city tried to regulate the dispensaries, there was tremendous resistance by those in the dispensary business. Eventually, regulation was adopted that allowed 4 dispensaries in the city, which I believe is what exists today. Dispensaries were not forthcoming with information. They grew until they were banned by many cities and counties. And I expect many cities and counties will not opt in with this legislation should this bill pass. This is not the way cities and counties choose to raise revenue. If you just look at the numbers of cities and counties that have opened themselves up to medical marijuana dispensaries, I would expect to have that amount or smaller based on my discussions with leaders in cities and counties, because this is not the way that they see being able to regulate or make money. This is not like prohibition. This is one state. This is not a federal way of doing things. And this is not going to control cannabis like alcohol. The second point is put our police priorities where they belong. Possession of an ounce of marijuana has been a low priority for a number of years, even before the Compassionate User Act of '96. Someone who is stopped with less than an ounce of marijuana receives a citation, a court date. A small report is written, evidence is turned in. It does not take law enforcement a lot of time to do this. The interactions that come up usually result from a car stop. Someone smells burnt marijuana in a car, sees a roach in an ashtray, and that's how those things happen. Those are not. No problem.
Okay.
Those are not high priorities with law enforcement. 1,500 people today are in prison for marijuana-related issues, and those are for sales, cultivation, and transportation. All felonies, all of which will exist today, even if this legislation passes. Proponents, and third point is that it will make lots of money. Proponents state that $1.4 billion will be available to the states. Well, again, cities and counties will opt in, but for $1.4 billion was the analysis for AB 390, not for Prop 19. I believe few will opt in based on the 215 experience. Open-air drug markets will continue because this does not affect youth under the age of 21 and cities and counties that do not opt in. I wish there was some way we could end open-air drug markets because I believe marijuana is one of the most deadliest forms of sales that exists today.
All right. Thank you. The senator has a question. I have some housekeeping things. I do want to say in terms of 215, it's a bit of apples and oranges. 215, when it passed with a populist vote, really did get a cold shoulder from the legislature. However, in the case of the passage of 19, we have anticipated that this question would be resolved either through an initiative process or legislation, and my office has produced that kind of legislation to actually address some of the gray areas that you talked about, particularly around regulations. And a city like San Francisco, for instance, when 215 passed, we were at the gate ready with a number of regulations and neighborhood strictures, and that all did happen. A little bumpy road, but we did anticipate it. And I would advise people in other cities and counties, one of the reasons you're having so many problems with regulation is because you put your head in the sand, thought that 215 was going to go away, spent a lot of state money on court cases, et cetera, and so forth. So I would advise cities and counties to start looking at what they're going to do if 19 passes, and not to continue to keep their head in the sand about this. And there could be a benefit in taxation, obviously, depending on what the local community wants. I will say that my legislation calls for uniform state application, and there are some other issues involved with the initiative that could be addressed in legislation. So all is not lost, and we're not going to see, if 19 passes, we're not going to see a repeat of what happened with 215. Senator?
Sure. Thank you. Chief, I just wanted to clarify, make sure I didn't hear something from you that we didn't hear from the LAO. Your concern about Prop 19 not regulating and taxing marijuana as alcohol is because it would put the decision-making into the hands of local governments as opposed to the state, though the LAO said that the measure does state that it's permissive for both state and local government. Do you disagree with that?
Once again, the LAO mentioned a lot of uncertainty. I think the emphasis here, even from the proponents, is that it go to the local control.
But it does give permission to state government by a majority vote to regulate and tax uniformly across the state.
It does.
Okay, so I just want to clarify that. And then your concern for people who are high in marijuana being behind the wheel of a car, did we see, as you pointed out, the indicators of roaches and marijuana smoke and such, great increase after the passage of Prop 215?
I don't have any statistics that would say yes or no to that, so I'm not going to guess.
Okay, so it's fair enough to say that maybe it's conjecture that if Prop 19 passed, that increase would happen if we don't have documentation that didn't happen with Prop 215.
I just think there'll be more marijuana accessible if Prop 19 does pass, so one could speculate that there'll be more marijuana everywhere.
And if we had a measure, and I don't mean to throw in a hypothetical here, but possibly, and we'll get clarification with further testimony, Prop 19 is that vehicle. But if we were to very specifically duplicate the regulation and taxation of alcohol for marijuana, ending prohibition. I suspect you support the removal of prohibition for alcohol. Would you support it for the removal of prohibition for marijuana?
To be honest, the devil would be in the details of what that would have to say.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And two housekeeping things. We have two replacements. One will be Dale Sky Jones with the SN19, and she's taking Miss Evans's place. And then Stephen Downing will be taking Mr. Cox's place. Well, so welcome. And then Mr. Scully, Miss Scully, pardon me.
Thank you. Jan Scully, Sacramento County District Attorney. And
Mr. Attorney, you want to get a little closer to your microphone?
Sorry.
Great.
Jan Scully, Sacramento County District Attorney, and here also on behalf of the California District Attorneys Association. And thank you for having us here today. As you heard from the chief, the CDCR actually reports that 1,500 inmates are incarcerated in the California State Prison on marijuana-related offenses, which is less than 1% of the inmate population. And state prosecutors and sheriffs and agree with the California Police Chiefs Association when they say that there are no significant police resources as well as prosecution resources being devoted to the enforcement of laws against minor possession of marijuana. And in fact, the penalty in California for small amounts of marijuana is nothing more than a traffic ticket, a small fine of $100. So we're not spending a lot of time on those cases. The language of Proposition 19 states it would not be illegal to drive a vehicle that actually impairs, but provides no definition and for which there are no correlative studies or tests between marijuana and driving skills as there are for alcohol. With all the various, as you've heard, all the various local jurisdictions, both county jurisdictions and city jurisdictions that are allowed to regulate within their own area, the marijuana laws under Prop 19, it makes enforcement from a public safety standpoint virtually impossible, because when people are moving, transferring back and forth in between counties or even within their own counties, it'll be impossible to prove where that marijuana originated, and so it makes it literally impossible to do that. And if you add on, when you say that there are some aspects of Prop 19 that are permissive for the state to also get engaged in and regulate, well, that just compounds the morass and the nightmare of all the inconsistencies. I think one of the things that is the most, one of the more misrepresentatives is that we're looking at this as if we're dealing with and controlling alcohol. Again, alcohol is regulated, controlled on a statewide basis, and that is the regulation. That is not true of marijuana under this initiative. According to the RAND Corporation that released a report this summer, that legalization means that of marijuana means that prices will come down, the number of users will go up, and the underground market will adapt. And so the revenue gained through the regulated market will never keep pace with the financial and social costs. This will not impact the drug cartels that are coming across the borders now and actually growing marijuana on our state and our federal lands. And the National Drug Czar, actually the federal government has weighed in on this issue, because I believe it was back in March, the National Drug Czar, Gail Kelikowski, actually told the California police chiefs that legalization of marijuana is a non-starter for the administration. He also said that legalization will increase the abuse, and its social costs would outweigh any possible revenue. Two other main points, although there are a lot we could make. First of all, with consumption going up, already juveniles, underage users already present a significant percentage of the number of individuals that are using marijuana.
I want to keep this balanced, and you have about a minute. Let me ask you first. Let me say this with all deference to your on-the-ground experience. I think a lot of what you're postulating is based on status quo, that the situation in Mexico will stay the same. When as a matter of fact, there is a movement in Mexico now to legalize all drugs as a reaction, a very severe reaction to the carnage that is happening here. So we may not have the same situation. And in fact, in talking to officials of the Mexican consulate, the point is often brought up that we are, with our appetite for drugs here in the United States, we have a joint responsibility, no pun intended, around what is happening in Mexico. So I think we are seeing portals being opened where it just will not be a California issue, but it'll be more of an international issue, particularly because our borders are so close. The other thing is a drug czar today could be on Dancing with the Stars tomorrow. Administrations are known to change, be chameleon-like. Actually, my assessment of the administration, and I don't want to debate this now, is that they're sending out some kind of a double message, particularly when you see the authority given to medical marijuana. So, what you're referring to today may not exist, and would really make an initiative like this not only necessary, but an accommodation to what the world market is. And then the other thing I wanted to say to you was a lot of time is wasted around misdemeanor charges around marijuana. Wouldn't there be a cost savings here if there was a legalization? And I don't want to cut you short, and the senator may have a question too, but we do want to have the balance of the discussion.
Okay, I still would like to finish my couple of points. Although to respond, first of all, we're not expending significant resources or literally minimal resources, if any, on small amounts of marijuana. That's just my world as a line prosecutor.
Those minimal resources to you could be crucial resources to a drug prevention program, or, I think scoring any savings here is going to be important. You may think they're minimal, and maybe I wouldn't disagree, but they're still savings.
What's a cost benefit?
They will accumulate.
It's a cost-benefit analysis, and so we'll agree to disagree on that. It is a little-known fact, to respond to the Mexican issue, is that about a year ago, Mexico passed its own version of Prop 19 for possession of small amounts of marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, and in fact, the violence and murders in Mexico have not gone down. But that's irrespective. They're still coming across our border. They're still growing, and California becomes even more of a magnet than it already is, and it will impact in a more significant way our youth. And the last point is on the revenue projections and taxes and fees that are able to be proposed. There is a federal law that says that, since it is still a violation of federal law, that you don't have to pay taxes and fees in connection with something that could be deemed to be unlawful, because that's a Fifth Amendment violation of your right to incriminate. Last thing is that it is still against the federal law, and as cops and prosecutors here, we're still sworn, whether we agree with the law or not, to uphold it and enforce it.
All right, because there's a lot of banking laws that are preempted by federal laws, so that might be something you want to look towards for enforcement as well. Okay? Mr. Downey.
Or just a couple questions.
Oh, sorry, sir.
It's not. It's one-sided.
No, just one moment. Thank you. I just wanted to state that I think you used the figure approximately, is it 1,300 state prisoners relative to felony
Actually,
conviction?
1,499.
1,499. I don't think that tells quite the story, the entire story, because I've seen figures, someone here might be able to correct me, approximately 70,000 misdemeanor possession arrests in California annually for marijuana. So that's a huge number, and that's really what we're trying to address.
But nobody's going to jail, Senator.
I agree, and I thank the District Attorneys Association for supporting our bill, which is now on the governor's desk, which would call that infraction what it really is, an infraction, so we don't have
violate probation.
All those have jury trials as an option for them as well. As did the chief comment, a concern that we would have a patchwork of local ordinances, which would make it a nightmare for law enforcement to enforce, and if the state came in, it would make it even more complex. Given that the LAO has clarified that the measure does give permission to both state and local governments to regulate and tax. My next question would be, if there were, let's say, a dozen local ordinances or so, and the state did decide to take action, wouldn't the state law override the local ordinances? So we would have a comprehensive and uniform law across the state should the legislature take action, which the measure allows for.
I don't believe that will happen under Proposition 19. There is so much intentional vagaries here, so much undefined, so much open language that, in fact, this case or this initiative, if it passes, will be fraught with litigation and civil liabilities and other things that will take for years to ever settle. So this is a totally unworkable document. People that I talk to that even support legalization of marijuana say this is not the vehicle.
Right. Not unlike most state initiatives which end up in court. And then, so I think we want to get some clarity. I'm sure the proponents may have some ideas on that as well. But I also want to just raise the question as to whether, in fact, consumption will go up. There was a study put out by Harvard economist Jeffrey Mirren in 2005. He addressed in his study the estimated taxes that would be brought in nationwide, and then he also argued that usage rates would not necessarily rise if marijuana was legal. And making reference again to the last call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition by Daniel Ockrent, he points out that when Prohibition came to an end, with closing hours, age limitations, and government's ability to shutter violators, it actually made it harder for underage people to get a drink. And I think that's quite possible with regulation of marijuana as a legal product as opposed to illegal. And lastly, again,
but are you making a comment for me to respond?
No, we have to move forward.
Just one last point to be made, that I think the history books tell us that after Prohibition was repealed, alcohol smuggling and illegal manufacturing did not stay high, that those rates came down, and the gang culture of Prohibition wound down and finally came to an end. So I think that there's some lesson for us to be learned from the repeal of Prohibition.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Scully. Mr. Downey.
Good morning. My name is Steve Downing. I'm a retired deputy chief in the Los Angeles Police Department. I served in the LAPD for 20 years. A number of those years, I was a captain in South Central Los Angeles. I'll do it.
Great.
A number of those years, I was a captain in South Central Los Angeles, later a commander, commanding the Bureau of Special Investigation, running and implementing the war on drugs after Nixon declared it in 1973, and later in the capacity as the deputy chief. I'd like to make just a couple of quick comments on the traffic tickets. I heard the number of misdemeanor arrests was 60,000, but it was 70,000. To me, this issue is about public safety and smart law enforcement. We know that marijuana is less dangerous than alcohol. That's a given. I think that's understood scientifically and medically across the board. There's still misdemeanors. We're still making criminals out of people. So we made criminals out of 60,000 people for possessing marijuana last year. But what's the cost of law enforcement? The three drug czars wrote an op-ed here a while back and called this just such a simplistic thing, these traffic tickets. 60,000 traffic tickets. Picture it. The officer writes the traffic ticket like he would running a red light. But what follows that? What follows that is the officer has to go to the station because he has evidence that he has to book. That evidence has to be processed in the crime labs. If the violator goes to court, the crime lab technician has to go to court and testify. I think if you studied it real closely, you might find that each one of those tickets that are written costs about $900. 60,000 times $900. It's a waste of a law enforcement resource, especially when marijuana is less dangerous than alcohol. Non-starter with the feds. When Prohibition ended, New York stopped enforcing laws related to alcohol 5 years before the end of Prohibition. California stopped enforcing laws related to Prohibition 1 year before the end of Prohibition. So if Proposition 19 passes, I think that what we're looking at is a people's movement, a tsunami across the country, and like with medical marijuana, when the AG said leave California alone, I think they're going to have to think twice if Proposition 19 passes. A little bit of history about why is the possession of marijuana a crime? Why is it a crime? Well, it was first made a crime in 1937, and the marketing for that crime was based on biases of powerful people, and they marketed it by saying that people of color, musicians, those sorts of people are going to use that devil weed and they're going to rape our white women. That's how marijuana first became outlawed. Now we jump 34 years later and we come up to 1971. President Nixon commissioned appointed Governor Raymond P. Schaefer of Pennsylvania to chair a national commission to report on the effects of marijuana and other drugs and recommend appropriate drug policies. Governor Schaefer was a former prosecutor who was well known as a law and order governor. The Schaefer Commission conducted the most extensive and comprehensive examination of marijuana ever performed by the U.S. government, ever performed prior and since. His findings came from more than 50 projects that were funded. And they found, you can read the Schaefer, I won't go through it, the commission, but they found everything that we're saying about marijuana. We should not outlaw it. We should not outlaw it. President Nixon called Schaefer on the carpet and pressured him to change the commission's conclusion, saying, you see, the thing that is so terribly important here is that it not appear that the commission's frankly just a bunch of do-gooders. Governor Schaefer declined to change his conclusions. Nixon declined to appoint him to a pending federal judgeship. The commission study was buried. Nixon, in the Nixon tapes, made this statement that when he was talking with Art Linkletter about radical demonstrators, he said, they're all on drugs. On another occasion, Nixon compared marijuana to alcohol use, saying that marijuana users smoke it to get high, while the person drinks to have fun. He wanted him to be strong like the Russians, and to scare marijuana users, Nixon ordered his administration to come down hard on users to target them as enemies in his war on drugs. So it's bias. 2 years later, Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1973. I was a commander in Southwest Division in the Los Angeles Police Department. I just had taken over the division in the early 70s, and as a new commander, you look around for things that the guys before you didn't see, and I discovered there was an emerging phenomenon in our division called gangs. There are two little gangs. One was called the Crips and one was called the Bloods. That was in 1970. Nixon declared the war on drugs in 73. Now, 40 years later, because of the profits from drugs, those gangs have expanded into the hundreds, with hundreds of thousands of members across the United States. Those gang members are funded by drug profits. The White House most recently said that 65% of the cartel's profits are from marijuana, 65%. Yes, sir.
1 minute.
1 minute? Okay, I'll wrap up. Those gangs are their couriers, their enforcers, their collectors, and their assassins. The drug cartels in the last 4 years under the Calderon war on drugs have murdered 27,000 people. Last year alone, 7,000 people were murdered along our borders. They have silently invaded 250 American cities. 65% of their profit is marijuana. This is not an organization you can cut the head off. You can't cut the legs off like you do a spider. It's starfish. You cut an arm off, it grows back. You cut it in half, it comes back twice. What you have to do is starve the starfish, remove its nutrient. It floats in a sea of cash. You take the cash away, the starfish is going to die. And Proposition 19 is the perfect first step to begin our exit strategy on the war on drugs. That's 40 years old. It's time to change. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And starfish reminds me of SpongeBob SquarePants. An admirable analogy, I guess. You've had a lot of experience on the ground with the troops in the trenches, as Mr. Dunbar. Can you just give us very, very briefly before we go on to the next speaker? What are the cops on the street thinking in terms of this issue? I'll tell you, in San Francisco, it's a fairly mixed bag, with the propensity thinking that the legalization could work for them. You know, if they're included on some of the devil in the details work. You know, so do you have a sense of that?
How do the cops on the ground feel versus brass?
You know, I would have a hard time answering that question right now. I have been retired for a number of years from the LAPD. Most of my contact with law enforcement is with the brass and not so much with the ground troops. But let me tell you, the police officer on the street likes to do his job. He likes to catch real crooks. He likes to get bank robbers. He likes to get liquor store stick-up guys. He likes to get burglars. He likes to help people. And marijuana, a little bit of marijuana is going to take him off the street 2 hours.
Sir? Okay. All right. If we could, we'll now go to Ms. Jones with the Yes on 19 campaign.
Thank you. And I do appreciate your time and consideration in having a good, honest conversation today about what Prop 19 does and doesn't do. Prop 19 is, as you mentioned, a very important first step. Prop 19 was very carefully crafted to be sensitive to current law and also, importantly, to offer up not a lockbox but a toolbox so that local cities and counties can take control in the meantime while the legislature decides what to do. So both paths moving forward are an opportunity. There's also, it's important to realize with a voter initiative that we did not want to tie the hands when it came to too many specifics, to actually avoid some of the disingenuous scare tactics of a free-for-all. The free-for-all is right now, and cannabis is more accessible to our children than any other drug out there. And it's because the only folks that control cannabis are the criminals, and they do not card your children before they offer them pot. They also don't care what else they offer them in the meantime. So the issue here is not cannabis itself, it's the prohibition that's pushing the safest therapeutic substance known to man into the hands of dangerous drug criminals. And they're going to do anything that they need to protect those profits. We are looking to control cannabis very similar to alcohol and follow the same path as dismantling the first prohibition failure many, many years ago. If over 60% of our drug cartels' operating profits are based on running cannabis, we've got to realize, let's just tiptoe into reality. When we started controlling alcohol, we don't have illegal grape-growing cartels in our national forests. When you have two competitors going after the same market share, they don't take out guns, they take out advertising. And this is the difference. We need to shift it out of, the criminal market and put it back in the hands of folks that would lose their license if they sell it to children. It's been proven across the states that have finally legalized medical use that childhood use, in fact, is down. And in all of the scare tactics that we heard in passing Prop 215 and moving forward with SB 420, we don't see a proliferation of emergency room visits. In fact, they're negligible to the point of not even being mentioned in most government reports because the numbers are so low. When we talk about societal costs, we're looking at the top two killers for adults as alcohol and tobacco, and cannabis is safer. We're looking at about $20 per capita per user for societal costs for cannabis versus $600 to $800 per user for alcohol and tobacco. And we talk about the potential societal costs, but in fact, we're collecting nothing for that right now. And we can shift those dollars, take them out of the hands of cartels, and finally put them in the hands of the cities and counties to put this towards education, to put it towards law enforcement, to redirect our priorities to what matters most to Californians, and frankly, for California to get its fair share. In respect to, or with respect rather, to some of the other issues with safety, I want to point out that our law enforcement officers are truly already very well trained on how to deal with drugged driving, drunk driving, or just plain irresponsible driving. I fear somebody taking prescription meds just as much as being drunk these days with what's going on with that. Our officers are trained to recognize via per se driving limits. These are experts in their industry to recognize when you are incapable of continuing to drive your car. Those laws haven't changed. In fact, we made sure that these laws, especially sensitive to public safety, were enforced and, in fact, added a couple to ensure that you could not smoke in front of children, nor could you do anything that would impair a driver, and specifically if you're involved in any type of public safety job. We ensured that the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988 is free and clear to be upheld. In fact, employers have a right and a responsibility to uphold the policies that they set in place. No state law can require an employer to violate federal mandate supremacy clause. This is fundamental. And there is nothing in Prop 215 that brings positive conflict to federal law. In fact, no state can be forced to enact or uphold federal law. And what we can't forget when we get locked up in the tax conversation is a very, very important part of Prop 215 is the decriminalization aspects. We are allowed to stop enforcing prohibition, and that's a huge chunk of what Prop 19 does. I'm not concerned about this patchwork because I realize that our cities and counties do many things on local levels quite successfully, and there may in fact be a couple of lawsuits brought, just like lawsuits are brought to most things that happen these days, and I'm pretty sure that we have the leaders that can figure that out. I also want to point out that bringing cannabis to work is still very much illegal if you don't allow it, much like alcohol or your dog. You can have rules. As long as it's a posted policy, you get control over whatever happens on your private property. So this is protecting both the workplace and private property laws, those of landlords, things along those lines. Very sensitive to current laws. As far as the claim that you can only do anything after an accident, that's just frankly disingenuous. If you have the rule set up to drug test, you can continue with that. It's time to refocus our priorities. Right now, we look at putting kids in prison instead of school, and our prison industrial complex is up 400%. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for our schools. And yet it's shown that through education, even just for example, tobacco, we went from about 60% of Americans smoking tobacco to about 20%. And that's not from cracking heads and putting them in prison. It was through education. And we can do the same here with cannabis. When you look at other countries, such as Portugal, that has decriminalized, the worst has not happened. In fact, crime is down. We need to focus on what drops our value as communities. We need to focus on the property crimes, the crimes against others, violent crimes, the over 60,000 unsolved crimes that our officers did not have time for because they were busy chasing cannabis possessors. In closing, I just want to point out that we have an opportunity here in California. We recognize the status quo has failed. And this is simply a first step to take control away from the criminals. Now, this point, if we choose to control, tax, and regulate cannabis, not just for adult use, but importantly to clarify medical use, because the law of the land is cloudy right now. And again, I'd like to point out most of the issues in California were not due to the cannabis. It was due to a lack of regulation because of an inconsistency, or rather a cloudiness in the state law about whether or not we could regulate sales. Prop 19 clarifies the ability for both the legislature and local communities to choose control and strike a blow larger than any law enforcement effort ever could at the illegal cartels. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And would it be safe to say, with the passage of 19, that the sponsors and advocate of Prop 19 are ready, willing, and able to work with the legislature?
Indeed, we're eager.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank
Senator?
you.
And you did touch on this question that I had asked earlier of the chief and the district attorney relative to the state's ability to create a uniform law across the state so that there would not be inconsistencies if that were to prove to be problematic.
Indeed, we encourage the legislature to take action, and we've been working with several, both Senator Calderon and Mr. Amiano as well, to try to take that to the next step and redirect the monies from either an excise tax. Of course, we have sales tax, with the general fund, but we also have fees and assessments that can be directed both on a state level or local level. So we really have an opportunity for both. The concern, as Assemblymember Amiano pointed out, was that there might not be any action. So we needed to ensure that in the meantime, those cities that were ready to act, like Berkeley or Oakland, that are ready to tax and regulate immediately and just waiting for us to pass it, can do so.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, panel members, very
you.
much. I'm going to do a little switch here because of airline reservations, etc. We're going to call on panel number 5, Proposition 19, an effective drug policy. And the list I have here is Dr. Bo Kilmer from the RAND Research Center, Erica Frank, General Counsel, California Chamber of Commerce, Irene Wakabashi, Supervising Deputy District Attorney, Alice Huffman of Los Angeles, Alice Huffman, President of the California State NAACP, and then Nate Bradley, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Welcome. All right, why don't we start with Mr. Kilmer from the RAND Research Center. And again, we're trying to be very rigorous here, so each presentation will be 5 minutes. We're running a little behind schedule, but I think the discussion is definitely worth it. So, Mr. Kilmer.
Yeah. Chairman Amiano, Chairman Leno, members of the committee, thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Bo Kilmer, and I'm the co-director of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center. RAND is a nonprofit research organization that has informed drug policy debates for more than 20 years. We do not take positions on specific bills or ballot initiatives, and we do not have an official stance on marijuana reform. In July 2010, we released a report which assessed how marijuana legalization in California could influence marijuana consumption and public budgets. And today I would like to highlight 3 points from that study, which I think are useful for discussions about Proposition 19. The first point is that after legalization, the pre-tax retail price is going to drop dramatically. The second point is that after legalization, consumption will increase, but it's unclear by how much. And finally, policymakers and analysts need to think seriously about the optimal tax rate for marijuana. Right now, if you want to get an ounce of high-quality marijuana, Sinsemilla here in California, it's going to run you about $250 to $400 an ounce. There are a number of reasons to believe that that price would drop post-legalization. Most obviously, the risk is going to go down. Right now, when you buy cocaine or heroin or marijuana, a lot of what you're doing is compensating the dealer and everyone else along the supply chain for the risk of arrest and incarceration. That goes away with full legalization. We would also expect the price to go down because there would be more automation and economies of scale. So in our report, we actually estimated production costs, assuming that the federal government would allow a grow house model, and we calculated that the pre-tax retail price would drop by more than 80%. Now, I'm only aware of 2 other estimates which have tried to predict what the price drop would be in California, and ours falls right in the middle. The Board of Equalization's estimate of Chairman Amiano's bill assumed that there would be a 50% drop after legalization. And last year, Normal testified that if unregulated, the price of an ounce could drop from $300 to just a few dollars an ounce, if unregulated. Now, sure, regulation would add to those production costs, but the takeaway here is that the price drop would be dramatic. Which leads me to my second point, that post-legalization, we expect consumption to increase for a few reasons. It can change availability, changes in perceived harmfulness. Probably most important would be promotion and advertising. The second reason would increase because of price effects. I mean, if you have a really large price decrease, and we know that users and potential users are sensitive to the price, we would expect there to be a tick up in consumption. However, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the size of that increase. We don't know what the retail price is going to be after taxes. We don't know the level of tax evasion. We don't know the amount of advertising. We don't know what the federal government's response is going to be. And we don't know what the shape of the supply and the demand curves are for marijuana. So we tried to assemble the evidence from the peer-reviewed and the gray literatures, and we did our best effort to try to build a model and try to figure out what that would be. And with our models, we couldn't rule out increases in total consumption of 50 to 100%, perhaps more, but we don't really know. But to put this in perspective, in any given month in California, 6.5% of all Californians report consuming marijuana. Now, let's say that doubled, that increased to 100%. We'd be at 13%, and that's where we were in the late 1970s. Now, granted, today marijuana is a bit stronger and society has changed. We have less disco. But we have lived in a society before where the prevalence rate has been twice as high. Now, finally, regardless of how you feel about Proposition 19, if it passes, we're all going to have to think seriously about setting the right tax rate. Obviously, if the tax rate is set too high, there's going to be tax evasion. And tax evasion is bad not only because it's going to reduce money that comes to the state and local governments, but also because it reduces the prices faced by consumers. Now, as part of our report, we tried to look at how much tobacco tax evasion there was occurring in California, and there's sharp disagreement. Some folks put it at 1 to 4%. More recently, the Board of Equalization assumed that there was 15% tobacco tax evasion in California. We don't know how much there is. We know it happens. But it's important to note that in no state is the excise tax for tobacco more than $6.50. Here in California, it's about $1.25. This raises really important questions about what is going to be that right tax rate that's going to maximize revenue and minimize evasion. And some people may also be interested in what would be the rate that would maximize revenue and reduce social costs.
Okay, you have about a minute.
Okay, I'm going to use less than that. And as we all know, Proposition 19 is going to allow the local jurisdictions to create their own tax rates. This means there's a real possibility of a race to the bottom here where different jurisdictions could possibly lower taxes in order to stay competitive. And this is different from the bill introduced by Chairman Amiano. So I think if Proposition 19 does pass, a key challenge for policymakers is going to be trying to figure out how can we prevent this possible race to the bottom. One idea would be you can make certain government funds dependent on a certain tax rate. I think there are other ideas out there as well, and I think they deserve rigorous analysis. So with that, I will close, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator?
Thank you. A very interesting presentation. Thank you for it. A couple of questions. I hadn't thought about this, but as the measure is written, I know that the legislature can amend it as long as it's along the lines of the intent of the measure. Would the legislature be able to restrict advertisements similar to those upon alcohol and tobacco?
That is a great question. You know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if it would allow for that. But that is something that I think that the legislature should be thinking about right now.
And a full disclosure, too, in conversations with the sponsors of 19, they are looking at that as a request, that there would be some prohibition on that. That has to be pursued, you know, along the First Amendment rights, et cetera.
Yeah.
But there is a sympathetic ear.
Yeah, good. It's important to think
in your
about.
conclusion that consumption would increase, did you look at rates of consumption after the decriminalization in countries like Holland and in Portugal?
That's actually really interesting because a lot of people like to think that marijuana was legalized in the Netherlands. It was not. They tolerate purchases and the possession of small amounts. I mean, anyone could walk into one of those coffee shops and buy up to, if you're over 18, you can buy up to 5 grams. But they tolerate that. But in the back door, it's still illegal to produce it and distribute it. So I mean, there are some things we can look at with respect to when the coffee shops increased, and we did look at that with respect to some of the non-price effects. But we can't just look at what happened in the Netherlands to get a really good idea about what's going to happen.
Talking about shift of culture, that you can actually walk off the street into your corner coffee shop and be able to purchase and consume. And rates didn't go up.
No, what happened was initially when they passed the opium law, and when they passed the law in 1976, which essentially decriminalized possession of small amounts and sales, nothing really happened with consumption. However, as the number of coffee shops started to increase in Holland, so did lifetime use for youth. Now, it's hard to get a real causal estimate here about whether or not it increased use.
Because we're not talking about that.
Yeah, but what's interesting, well, with respect to advertising, it can make a difference, though. But what's interesting is if you look at the use rates or like lifetime use rates for teens during that period in the Netherlands, it was going up while it wasn't necessarily increasing in other areas. I mean, it's really hard to make a strong causal claim here, but we do use that insight to help give us some insight about some of the possible non-price effects. But ultimately, we conclude that with respect to the non-price effects and the price effects, there's just too much uncertainty to come up with a precise price estimate, but we do believe it will go up.
Okay, and then anything to be learned from Portugal at all?
Well, Portugal is interesting because they didn't legalize marijuana. They decriminalized small amounts.
Okay.
And once again, their data constraints preclude, say, really figuring out whether or not the program made a big difference with respect to marijuana use. But I think most people would realize that what happened there definitely was not a disaster.
And then one last question. This has to do with tax rate and tax evasion. So if we're going to see this significant plummet in the pre-tax price, and we didn't want to necessarily encourage additional consumption by the lower price, we could make up that significant difference, of course, with tax. And so the government would be benefiting from it, the people, rather than the cartels.
That works as long as you can collect that tax.
Right. So
because that's the thing. I mean, right now, if an ounce of sinsemilla runs you $250 to $400, let's say that drops down to $50.
Right.
If you think that you're going to be able to put a $200 tax on an ounce of sinsemilla, given that we already have this black market right now, I just think it's going to be really hard to sustain that. And it's even harder to sustain with Proposition 19 because each of the local jurisdictions will be coming up with their own, possibly with their own tax rates. That's why I think this is important. And regardless of how you feel about Proposition 19, if this passes, we all want to think about this because we really do want to keep the tax rates as high as possible while minimizing the evasion.
There'll be a sweet spot somewhere.
Well, I hope so.
And then, but you then sparked another question. We wouldn't want necessarily encourage local producers of marijuana to think they could take their product to market to other states in a black market because they could sell it for so much lower.
I mean, that's what's really...
We'd miss the tax, and we'd be impacting other states.
Exactly, because you realize it would lead to such a large price reduction. As part of this analysis, not only did we look at what would happen to the price of marijuana, we also estimated smuggling costs. And we figured out that even with the price drop, let's even assume we use a $50 an ounce tax. If you once you throw on smuggling costs, the sinsemilla grown in California would still be price competitive with a lot of the sinsemilla being sold throughout the country.
So,
And so,
again,
so on one hand, if California is able to collect taxes on that, they could actually make a lot of money. But you can imagine that the federal government and other states may have issues with that.
But I would imagine that the proponents of Prop 19 are not looking to enrich in-state growers by marketing their product out of state. And so it leads to my next question, which is, there's nothing in the measure which would preempt the legislature from passing a law that would make it a crime for local
I mean, it's
producers.
a crime right now to smuggle marijuana. So.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. It is interesting to note, too, that there are a number of medical marijuana dispensaries volunteering to pay taxes. And in fact, it did happen in Oakland. So you're right. It is an open question, actually quite exciting. I think we need a business plan, is what. Yes. Speaking of that, our next speaker from the California Chamber, Ms. Frank.
Good morning, Erica Frank. I'm General Counsel of the California Chamber of Commerce. And the California Chamber of Commerce produces employment law products for our members to assist them in navigating through the variety of labor and employment laws that California has. And when Proposition 19 qualified for the ballot, we began to look at the initiative to determine what, if any, impact the initiative would have on the workplace, on employers, on existing law governing the employer's ability to maintain a drug and alcohol-free workplace. And as we started to look at the initiative, we realized that the initiative did indeed create a number of questions and concerns that would impact employers if the initiative were to pass. And while we realized that there were many efforts, intentions of bringing alcohol and marijuana to the same level playing field, we don't believe that the language of the initiative actually accomplishes this goal. Just to highlight a few of our concerns related to the initiative. For one, the initiative contains non-discrimination language that essentially ties employer hands and creates a protected class of marijuana users. It does so by prohibiting employers from disciplining or terminating an employee who uses marijuana unless that employer can show that the use actually impairs the employer's job performance. This notion of actual impairment is a new standard. It's a standard that does not exist today, and it really creates trouble and uncertainty for employers. Right now, under current law, employers may have a policy in place that precludes drug and alcohol use in the workplace. And if an employee comes in and violates that policy, the employer may discipline up to and including termination. If this initiative passes, however, that policy is no longer going to be viable, and it won't be viable because the language in the initiative precludes an employer from disciplining or terminating an employee unless the use of marijuana actually impairs the employee's job performance. So how does this create potential hazards in the workplace? Well, for one, the language doesn't allow action for potential impairment or for threats of impairment. It's actual impairment, and unfortunately, this could mean that that an accident has to happen or might happen before an employer could prove that the employee's use was actually impairing performance. The initiative also would allow smoking marijuana in the workplace, and it does so because under current law, smoking tobacco products are prohibited. This initiative would not prohibit employees from smoking marijuana in the workplace because marijuana is not tobacco. Moreover, because again of this non-discrimination clause, an employer would again not be able to act unless there's actual impairment from that employee's use. Also, and I know this will be discussed later in the panel, it calls into question whether an employer may maintain a drug-free workplace. Our position is that it doesn't, which then throws a number of employers out of compliance with federal law that does indeed require contractors and those receiving important grant dollars from maintaining a drug-free workplace. In addition, because the language of the initiative is so ambiguous and full of certainties, we do believe that the initiative will create a number of lawsuits and litigation. We can see, for example, claims that an employee was adversely treated not because of poor performance, but because that employee uses marijuana. There's also concerns about whether or not an employee who's terminated can claim that the termination was not for performance, but for indeed marijuana use. So the concerns that we have with the initiative are a number, and they all are around the employer's ability to set forth policies and allow those policies to be enforced and to maintain a safe workplace for everybody.
Thank you very much. We've kind of agreed not to ask too many questions because we want to hear from everyone.
Thank you.
But just as a general comment, let me say I have the language here before me, and it doesn't really seem to support some of your assumptions. And what I'd like to do is invite you, no matter what happens with the initiative, because I will continue on a legislative path, perhaps to work with the Chamber about these assumptions. And maybe we could clarify a lot for you. I want to take the time today.
We'd be happy to.
And the only reason, well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I say that is, and I was mentioning this to the Senator, when you're out there talking about your initiative or your legislation, people wait for you to finish, and then they have questions for you. And increasingly, there have been lines of people, 10 to 12 to 14 to 15, wanting to talk about business and business plans and business ventures, the entrepreneurial part of this, which really is not my bailiwick, but ironically, it is yours, and
indeed,
we may find common ground. But thank you very, very, very much.
My pleasure.
Okay, and Ms. Wakabayashi,
yes,
and then Ms. Huffman. Thank you. I hope I didn't mangle that.
No, that you didn't. It's perfect. Irene Wakabayashi. I'm with the DA's office in Los Angeles. I'm the head of the appellate division. And I'm actually here to expand a little bit on the Drug-Free Workplace Act. So this may... I know that we're with time, so if you want to interrupt any time, you can interrupt and ask me questions. I think I know what you are referring to in terms of the language of the proposition. The preamble does state that their intent is not to prohibit use of controlled substances in the workplace. It seems to say that in the preamble, but being an appellate attorney, I go to what the language of the statute actually says, because as we in the appellate world know, and we go in front of the courts all the time, you look to the language of the statute first. And if it's clear, then you really don't go to the intent. So when I looked at the language of the statute, the proposed section 11304 subsection C says, no person shall be punished, fined, discriminated against, or denied any right or privilege for lawfully engaging in conduct permitted by the Act. The only exception in that subsection is the existing right of an employer to address consumption that actually impairs job performance. And I think that's why there's a lot of vagueness in the law. And in my opinion, it's not even vague. I think that that's what we have to go by, because that's the actual language of the statute. And this does conflict with the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. There was mention by the proponent of the proposition that, in fact, if there is any conflict with federal law, the Supremacy Clause would in fact mandate that federal law would be implemented. However, I think there's two problems with that argument. The first problem with that argument is that the Drug-Free Workplace Act doesn't create a violation of law. What it does is it requires contractors and grantees that have contracts and grants with the federal government that are worth over $100,000 to maintain a drug-free workplace if they want that contract or grant. It doesn't mandate that employers have a drug-free workplace. It only mandates it if, in fact, they want a contract or grant.
Let me jump in.
Yeah.
Just again, a lot of people look at the alcohol issue and the marijuana issue. And I mean, obviously there are shadings, but I'm just curious, couldn't someone be surreptitiously drunk at work and not run afoul of the Drug Workplace Act, Force Act, and then why would marijuana be? How is it different?
Well, the drug-free workplace specifically addresses drugs, and we can go to United States Code 41 of the United States Code, Section 2C D1, and that specifically talks about. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong section. Anyways, it's in the code section, and it specifically states what is a controlled substance. It gives a definition, it references it, and it references marijuana. If you follow the codes, the tangled codes, if you follow them. So that's the difference in terms of alcohol and marijuana. The other issue I wanted to bring up about the Supremacy Clause is that we know for a fact, because of the Compassionate Use Act, that the federal law and the state law can go along and act side by side. So there is a concern because the Drug-Free Workplace Act specifically requires that there is no possession or no use in the workplace. Obviously sales and all those other things, but specifically possession and use as well. And I think that's what conflicts primarily Proposition 19. I just think, and I just want to echo what District Attorney Scully said, that I think this is a very confusing proposition, even if you support the concept of making possession of marijuana legal. This is a poorly written, from an appellate lawyer standpoint, it's a poorly written proposition. And I think this is just highlights one of the problems with the way it's written.
I thank you very much for your interpretation. I think, like the Bible, there are many interpretations, and in fact, this is such a populist issue, and people are taking the lead on this issue. If in fact it does pass or legislation gets approved, we're just going to have to work all this stuff out. And it seems to me there's parallels with many other initiatives that have been on the ballot. And again, your insights and your analysis are very impressive, particularly to a layman. But I also understand that many of these things are malleable and many of these things are priorities. And I think instead of just saying, don't vote for this, we need to start saying this area is going to change, whether it's through this initiative or not. And what can people like you who work with the appellate courts, with your background and your intelligence, what can you do to help us? Anyway, I might count on you eventually.
And I understand that, but there are a lot of groups out there that litigate, and we've seen that in the Compassionate Use Act. So I can't speak for the chamber, but if you have a business and there are these vagaries and there's possibility for litigation, I think it's of concern.
Yeah, and again, not to trivialize that, but we live in a very litigious world, and frankly, my political career wouldn't have moved anywhere if I let these kind of analysis stop, because sometimes there's issues, social justice issues and civil rights issues that also impact and are not as clear or precise. In fact, I'd say some of the law itself is vague and probably was left that way so that you could have your interpretation. And speaking of the social justice issues, Ms. Huffman from the NAACP.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Senators. I am glad to be with you again to talk about my community's rights. People wonder how this is a civil rights issue. And I just want to say at the outset, if you look at that chart on the side there, you can see the black line obviously is for African American arrests, and the black line is African American arrests, and the pink line is white arrests. You can see the disproportionate application of the law on my community. Even though District Scully and others think that those infractions, those misdemeanors are minor, they take a great toll on my community when the law is not applied equally across the board as written. Therefore, we have an interest in supporting Prop 19 because we believe that if we can stop these misdemeanors, the war on drugs turns out to be a war on my community, a war on black kids and brown kids, and not a war on white kids that are breaking the same law. So if we can support Prop 19 and have it become legal, we think we will rescue a lot of people in our community who end up in the penal system. Now, I know it's a misdemeanor, they say, and they don't spend much money in the beginning, but a misdemeanor is the beginning of an infraction with law enforcement and getting into the criminal justice system. Therefore, it is not a gateway to other drugs in my community. It's a gateway to the penal system. It's a gateway to a life of crime and a gateway to having people's productive lives ripped away from them as they are incarcerated again and again and again until finally they become stewards of the criminal justice system and of California instead of productive citizens in our state. When you look at the cost of incarceration as opposed to the cost of education, I can't wait for you all to start making laws that will take some of the savings that we will save from these low-level drug crimes that are being locked up in the criminal justice system and try to reapply that money to some positive things in our community. If I need to say, just for the record, I am not advocating marijuana for recreational use. I am advocating the decriminalization of marijuana and the regulation of marijuana to keep our kids out of the criminal justice system. You know, I come over here oftentimes working on education. And before I saw these stats, you know, I thought I was really doing something great, trying to get more money for schools and trying to get the curriculum fixed. And once I saw these numbers, I realized that many of the kids I'm advocating for are already lost in the criminal justice system. How can you educate them when they're locked up for things that other people can do legally in California now? We have marijuana laws that allow medical people to use marijuana to help themselves out. We have pot doctors who will write for $100 a prescription for someone to get marijuana. You have a president who has smoked marijuana. You have one president who didn't inhale. You had another one, Mr. Bush, I don't know what he used, but he must have used an awful lot of something because, you know, you could tell. So some of his decisions were kind of good. But, I mean, how can you lock a child up for a joint and destroy that person's life and think that it's not hypocrisy in the system? Some have claimed that the NAACP is really off base, that this is not a civil rights issue, and some have even gone so far as to say I should resign. I think it's the opposite. I think when you look at what's happening in the criminal justice system in America and in California, that this is definitely something that we should get hold of. We should try and change this law. Government should not be doing morality legislation. You should be doing legal, litigious things. You let the morality of smoking pot and the morality of will they use more, the morality of the issues with youth that their parents should control, you leave that up to the right places to get that done. I hope this passes, and I hope you spend a lot of time legislating it, so that we can eventually have a justice in America, stop all this prohibition that hasn't worked, get rid of the gateway to prison for my community. You heard about the gangs? Well, you know, it's full employment for the gangs. You know, in those communities, quote, that we call the communities where my people live, there are a lot of good people in there. They are afraid of the gangs and all of the violence that go on there. I have people who travel with me on this issue. They break down crying over the number of people's lives who have been lost in the community from the violence of the gangs, and to see good families wiped out when somebody stands up against these drug laws in our community, not the drug laws, but the drug pushers.
You have 1 minute.
In our community. Thank you. And so we got duped with this war on drugs, thinking that it was going to make us safer. It has done just the opposite. It has made our communities more unsafe. And the fact that you have so many more arrests is because law enforcement targets my community. They put a rope around my community on the weekends and all, and these marijuana smells that come from cars and the what do they call, a roach or something that they find, that's because they're profiling my community, and they're stopping these people for these low-level things instead of getting the rapists and the robberies and all those people in the community. So I would urge everyone to vote yes on Prop 19 if you care about justice in America. Vote yes on Prop 19 if you care about rescuing these kids out of the prison system and putting them back in schools. And vote yes if you really want to take all that money that's going into the criminal justice system that's making America a negative place to live, one of the highest number of people, countries that has incarceration in the world. If you want to get those people out, this is the place to start. Okay. And this is why I'm standing here.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. We'll move right along to Mr. Bradley.
One question.
One question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For those who can't see the fine print, I just want to point out that we're comparing apples to apples and that these two different lines each are per 100,000 of a population of that community. So
yes,
we're looking at raw numbers here. I've seen the overall numbers. I've not seen it broken down by counties quite so. And even looking at San Francisco, the disparity is enormous, and that's of great concern to me. And I think, and if you could confirm this for me, these rates are in light of data that shows there's actually lower consumption rates in the African American community than in the Caucasian community.
Yes, so we use marijuana at a lower level than whites, but yet we are 33% of the arrests.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I just want to close by saying that I recognize some of the severe criticisms you have taken for your position on Prop 19, and irrespective of where anyone in the room might be on the subject matter, I just wanted to thank you for your courageous stance, because looking at these numbers, I know exactly what fuels your position.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bradley.
My name is Nate Bradley. I was a deputy sheriff and a police officer for about 6.5 years. I was laid off last year, which is why I'm able to come today and talk about this. I'm not somebody who wants everyone smoking weed. We can debate if it's safe or if it's dangerous all day. What I saw was a huge problem with our current policy. Within the first 2 weeks of being on the job, the big problem with our policy, I found, is that marijuana is sold in our schools. Alcohol isn't sold in our schools. You can buy it in little bottles at stores all around every school I worked, yet it's not sold in our schools. But weed is. It's illegal. We made these laws to supposedly protect our kids, but we've created a black market of people who don't care about how old our kids are, and this policy has encouraged people to, well, the policy encourages criminals to set up younger clientele. Unlike legal business owners who have licenses to lose, they don't care who they sell to, how it gets sold, the purity. It doesn't matter at all to them. It's all about money. And that blew my mind. I had always thought we were protecting our kids by keeping marijuana illegal. It's the exact opposite. We're putting this drug out there which could be laced with anything, and it's being passed around by kids that are 14 and 13, and the reason it is because we chose not to regulate that drug. We chose to let the black market, and it's time to end that. We can argue all day about what legal rights might happen, what lawyers or what employers might do, but what I'm worried about is the kids. What I'm worried about are children that have easier access to marijuana than they do alcohol. That worries me. And the only way to end that problem is to regulate that drug. We've tried to arrest our way out of this problem for 50 years. We made marijuana illegal in California in 1913. It's only gotten worse. In almost 100 years, we've created networks of people, and the policy itself, our current policy has created that. And if we can't look at our history and say, well, what did we do in our history to eliminate the crime from alcohol? Well, what we did was we legalized it. We regulated it. We took control. And that's what I want to do with, or we want to do with Prop 19, is take control and create better policy. A policy which allows us to have a say into where it goes, how it's sold, how it's made, how it's even packaged. Prop 19 creates policy which allows towns and counties to decide what kind of marketing is allowed. It's in the bill. If they don't want to allow pot leaves on the front of stores, then they are allowed to pass laws to ban those pot leaves. Prop 19 covered it. That is one of the biggest reasons I'm endorsing this bill, is because of the safety of our kids. And it's why many officers that can't be here today endorse it too, because I've got a son who's 2. I'm hoping by the time he's in junior high, we've got marijuana out of our schools. But if people vote no on this bill, it's going to continue the status quo, and marijuana will be in his school. I wanted to cover a couple another problems with the current policy is most people don't realize this. But each ticket, each little traffic ticket everyone likes to talk about, it's nothing. It costs us $1,000 on average when you add up the officer's time to book it, process it, to have it tested, sent to the courthouse for the DA to prosecute it. The maximum amount we're allowed to fine people, $100. We issued 60,000 tickets last year, or made arrests where marijuana was where marijuana possession was the highest charge. At $1,000 a pop, that's $60 million wasted to just prosecute tickets. How many cops' jobs could have been saved with that $60 million? How many teachers could we have teaching our kids with that $60 million just from just the tickets alone, let alone everything else we do to chase those people down? Another huge problem I saw with our policy is that we create law by prohibiting marijuana. We've created a law that cannot be enforced, and that creates a massive divide in the people that we protect.
1 minute.
Okay. One of the reasons that does, it creates a massive, it's because it's a law that can't be enforced. The public knows it. We know it. We're a joke. These laws are a joke. We need to stop making laws that are jokes and make laws that we can enforce. And we can control marijuana, but only if we legalize it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. It's been very, very edifying. I really appreciate your presentations.
Thank you.
All right. And our last but not least panel is the effect of Proposition 19 on cities and counties. Dorothy Johnson, Legislative Advocate, League of California Cities, and Elizabeth Howard Espinoza, Legislative Representative, California State Association of Counties. Welcome. And may I see how many people are interested in making public comment currently? Okay. Thank you.
Good morning. Dorothy Holzem with the League of California Cities. I first want to thank the chair and the committee for holding this hearing today. And while I understand the committee is most interested in hearing about implementation, I must first say for the record that the League did take an opposed position to this measure earlier this year. The discussion that led to the oppose was lengthy and telling of the issues that cities and the state may face if this proposition is passed. You've already heard from the District Attorneys Association, the police chiefs, and also the chamber, so I will defer my comments regarding the public safety concerns that our cities have also expressed and move on to the question, of implementation. Simply put, as we've heard earlier, there are ambiguities in this proposition, and that will make it difficult for cities to implement this this proposition. And while we would like to be able to forecast just how cities will go about doing this, simply put, again, every city will have to approach these problems differently. So what questions are our cities faced with? The most obvious here, I think, relates to the legal permitted amounts for possession. It's 1 ounce. For cultivation, 25 square feet. It's also unclear if the property owner approval is required before cultivating on rented or otherwise inhabited lands. The initiative states that cultivation on leased or rented property may be subject to approval from the owner of the property. So this could be read in at least two ways. It could be read to say that the owner could prohibit cultivation, or it could be read that it is up to the local government to decide if approval is actually required or not before cultivation can begin. Also related to cultivation, the League is receiving differing opinions from city attorneys related to the section 11300A2, which states that any person age 21 years or older could cultivate cannabis plants for personal consumption on an area of not more than 25 square feet per residence, or in absence of a residence, the parcel. So does this mean they can cultivate the 25 square feet or potentially the entire parcel of any size in absence of a residence? In addition, there are several terms used in the initiative that are undefined and unclear. These include transaction and transfer tax and benefit assessment, both of which would impact the city's ability to raise revenues. So putting all these ambiguities aside, Prop 19 does allow local governments broad authority to regulate marijuana. Most cities, as we know, are waiting for the outcome of the November election to move forward. However, I do want to provide a few examples of cities that are taking proactive steps should Prop 19 pass. Recently, the Galt City Council voiced support for a draft ordinance that would put a 45-day halt on marijuana sales in their cities to give the council ample time to review land use and zoning policies. They were concerned that if Prop 19 passed, the day after the election, marijuana businesses would open and begin selling without ordinances in place. If the city then tried to implement ordinances, the businesses could argue that they do not apply to their business. In addition, there's some other cities that have responded more so to the general medical marijuana issue and not so specifically to Prop 19. But one of those is Rancho Cordova, where the City Council has placed a measure on the ballot that would place a tax on cultivation on all residencies. This would be as much as $600 annually per square foot of indoor cultivation, and for outdoor cultivation, it could be as much as $600 for 12.5 square feet. San Jose is another city that's addressing the medical marijuana sales. They would place a 10% tax on all medical marijuana sales in their city after the November election. And another example we have to include, of course, is Oakland. While most cities in California have taken a opposed position to Prop 19, very early, City of Oakland embraced the notion of legalizing marijuana. And in July, the City Council voted to approve a plan that would license 4 production plants where marijuana would be grown, packaged, and processed in mass quantities. Proponents of the ordinance, of course, successfully argued that this would generate significant tax revenue and jobs for the city. So in closing, these 4 cities give us an idea of how big of a range different cities could respond following the possible passing of Prop 19. Clearly, each city will need to respond and react differently. But given the many ambiguities in this proposition, it will be a challenging and possibly drawn-out process, a delay that some individuals may take to their own advantage to the detriment of local resources and community members. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you very much for your points that you made. And broadly, though, 19 passes even with these challenges. Do you think that we could work out an effective way to help some of the cash-strapped communities that we represent?
Given the ambiguities, I think at its core, each local community will have to decide, each city, what is in their best interest, weighing the public safety and revenue pros and cons.
Possible for some regional cooperation? It does happen occasionally.
I know it's shocking. Agreed. No, it does happen. Agreed, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Ms. Espinosa.
Good morning, Chairs Amiano and Leno. Elizabeth Howard Espinosa on behalf of the California State Association of Counties. Perhaps I have the benefit of speaking last because many of the points that I intended to make have already been stated. CSAC, our association representing the 58 county boards of supervisors, has looked at Prop 19. Our board of directors had a discussion that was perhaps as lengthy and complex as the one you have had today. And ultimately, where our board fell was they were persuaded by the arguments believes that Proposition 19, and this is certainly not a statement against the legalization of marijuana, it was more a statement against the approach that is laid out in Proposition 19. We do believe that leaving the questions of sales, taxation, and regulation primarily to local governments will be very problematic, will set up difficulties for enforcement, and I think the very question that you've asked us to come to you and talk about today, the implementation, is one that we can't answer. We simply do not know how the 58 county boards of supervisors will respond. To Mr. Amiano's point, certainly there are some that will be eager to put in place the regulatory framework to benefit from the taxation opportunities and the control opportunities offered by Proposition 19. Others likely will not. We do not know how the 481 cities that reside or exist within our county jurisdictions will respond, and we do believe that while we manage with lots of different patchworks in county government and state government, this one will be particularly problematic. There certainly are offsetting benefits. The potential for revenue, which I think we've already discussed, is somewhat speculative, but certainly revenue would be an offsetting benefit. There will be some benefits by clarifying certain points of Proposition 215, although I would say that our board of directors also felt that 215 was a bit of a cautionary tale. We still are litigating a number of those points, and we anticipate similar paths of litigation with were Proposition 19 to pass. The bottom line, I think, for CSAC was that, as I indicated, we do not know how many of the 58 cities and 481, 58 counties rather, and 481 cities will respond to Proposition 19 if it passes, and certainly those who do choose to exercise their authorities under the initiative, there will not be uniform implementation. There will be cities and counties that make different decisions. At the line level, we think that's going to be difficult for public safety officers who are trying to enforce. There will be a diversity in approach and the resulting patchwork of regulation. Our members did express an openness to talking about the important issue of legalizing marijuana. They are not opposed to that discussion. They simply don't think that this is the right approach. And finally, I would end with questions on criminal justice savings. The LAO talked a bit about this, and I think what was difficult for us in our analysis was that we really couldn't determine the extent to which we would still have to enforce this, and there will be costs associated with enforcing this. Certainly, the legalization would mean we wouldn't be arresting people that we are arresting today. We don't think we're probably putting those folks in jail, so we don't know how much it will ease our persistent jail overcrowding. So we know that that's a difficult analysis to do, and just wanted to offer those perspectives. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your comments, and given the fact that this is an issue that is not going to go away, that Proposition 19 could in fact pass, I do appreciate your openness, because we're going to have to, in terms of state legislation, we're going to have to work in partnership, for the most positive result, even with the challenges. But I really appreciate you being here today, both of you. So thank you very, very much. I don't know if, Senator, or we'll go to public comment.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks again. All right, we're going to open this up to public comment, 2 minutes each. If you could approach the podium. Is that too much? Good morning, sir. If this is your first time here, I just wanted to explain the rooms of decorum and all right, 2 minutes.
I'm a little nervous looking around here. Good morning, Senators. I think one of the things that I would leave with today's hearing is, irrespective of your view on legalization of marijuana, and I think that's an issue about which there should be a serious discussion. Irrespective of that, this initiative is so flawed that it's not the approach to take. As the Sacramento Bee said on Sunday, this initiative shouldn't be approved just because it's the first one that made it to the ballot. What we know very quickly is that there will be an unfettered ability of anyone to grow marijuana in their communities, irrespective of local zoning, because the law says, irrespective of any other law, you have the right to grow 25 square feet. Are we going to have 25 square feet police who go in and have to enforce that? I mean, it's a little silly. We also know from the chamber testimony that there are serious workplace issues here. Understand, when we first went to the chamber, they were not interested in getting into this issue until they looked at the workplace safety. And we know from the fine work Ms. Wakabayashi did that there are real problems with the Drug-Free Workplace Safety Act of 1988. And what that means, that last thing means that rather than achieving revenue for the state, you are looking at the loss of $9.4 billion in federal aid to education that now comes to California because of non-compliance with the Drug-Free Act, and you are looking at the loss of conservatively another $30 billion that goes to federal contractors who provide goods and services to the feds because of that non-compliance. However you feel about the more global issue, this is a bad vehicle and needs to be rejected.
Next speaker, please.
Good morning, Assemblymen and Senators. My name is Ken Gillespie. I am currently going to school, pursuing a political science degree. I'm also a private first class in the Army National Guard, the California Army National Guard. And I'd like to bring to your attention the distinct possibility that if Prop 19 were to pass, that there's a great possibility that tourism in California will increase. I believe that there are a lot of people all over the world that want to come to California and spend their money here and contribute to our economy. Hopefully get us out of this horrible budget crisis that we're in, and bring some income and quite likely bring businesses from all over the world and the United States here to California. And I urge all of you and everyone else to vote yes on Proposition 19.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service. Next speaker, please.
Hello, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm Carla Lowe with Citizens Against Legalizing Marijuana. I've been an anti-drug activist for over 33 years. Was here before Public Safety Committee years ago on drug paraphernalia issues. We are against the idea of legalizing marijuana, not talking about how poorly this document is written, but reminding everyone who might not remember, we're talking about an illicit controlled substance, illegal for anybody under federal law. It's a Schedule I drug, controlled substance, because it's harmful, it's not effective for any medical use, it's addictive, it's mind-altering. Just to remind you that we're talking about the drug, that the THC, the mind-altering part of the drug that people use to get high, is now, it was 1% about 33 years ago when I first spoke to this body. None of you were here. It's now somewhere between 10 and 40%. Skunk marijuana average from Harborside in Oakland is 16%. It's no longer called pot by some of the experts. It's called skunk. I just want to mention my concern as a former teacher. My concern is children, the impact on the brain, the undeveloped brain, which I know another gentleman is going to speak about. I want to remind you that the dropout rate in California is about 25% now. That's about $390,000 per student. If you look at the total package, $46.4 billion. That is according to the UC Santa Barbara study in 2009. One other point I'd like to make is, according to the Cranker study, I'm looking at the drugged driving issue. Senator, since your bill 420 was signed into law, the issue of fatalities, marijuana-impaired drivers has doubled. Before that time, it was 631, and after your bill, then this 5-year period has been 1,240. So my 2 minutes are up. So this is why we think marijuana is not a good drug to legalize ever.
All right, thank you. All right, next speaker.
Thank you,
We're going to abandon the podium, huh? All right.
Tom Renfrey with the County Alcohol and Drug Program Administrators of California. I hope the previous speaker addresses those same arguments to alcohol as well. Unfortunately, that doesn't often happen. We have annually about 25,000 treatment admissions into our system where marijuana is identified as the primary drug of abuse. That's small compared to admissions for alcohol abuse. We don't know if those numbers will increase under this initiative, but the fact is the misuse of alcohol or any other drug is going to have an impact on our treatment system. Yet at both the state and local levels, our system gets only a fraction of the money, the resources that are devoted to law enforcement to deal with the drug problem. And there's no guarantee under this initiative that any of the tax dollars that are collected will go into the treatment system. Maybe this is something that can be dealt with in your bill, Assemblyman Amiano. We continue to pour vast amounts of money into law enforcement efforts to curb drug abuse, and the result is that high school students report that it's easier to get marijuana on their campuses than to get tobacco. So whatever happens with this initiative, we need to have a discussion about how to get more resources into our treatment system, and instead of this failed war on drugs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
I guess that would be me. Does this work? Now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. My name is Roger Morgan. I'm the Executive Director of Coalition for Drug-Free California. I want to make one point that I think should give you cause to pause. The human brain, as we know, is not fully developed until age 24 or 25. In the last 5 years, because of brain scan technology largely, we now know that marijuana can cause permanent damage on an underdeveloped brain, particularly during adolescence. It can also cause mental illness. And so the real goal here is that how do we protect the young people? If we continue to annihilate them, we have no future as a state or as a nation. As Carla mentioned, the current dropout rate is actually 24.2%. We know that smoking even one joint causes impairment in cognition even 28 days after smoking one joint. So in my opinion, there's no controls at the moment to keep kids from buying drugs. If you've got an ID card, you can go buy pot from any number of dispensaries and go sell it to kids. With Prop 19, if you can just go into Walgreens and buy it, go sell it to kids, that's a great way to work your way through college. So I would like to see some prevention built into whatever happens. Currently, we have the Sherman Law, which doesn't seem to be enforced at all, and I don't know why. That pertains to food, drugs, and cosmetics. Marijuana is being sold as both, and we're not doing anything about it. In terms of the social cost, with alcohol and tobacco, the cost is $9 for every $1 in tax collected. My belief is it will be a lot worse with marijuana. Marijuana combines the harms of both. I don't think you can control the taxes. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman Amiano, Chairman Leno. My name is Amir Deliri. I represent Can Lobby and the Cascade Wellness Center. It's a dispensary in Northern California. We'd just like to tell you that we are against Prop 19 because we feel its passage would severely affect patient access across the region. Furthermore, to address the decriminalization argument that the Prop 19 folks are making, just like to point out that the Senate Bill 1449 is on the governor's desk to sign that does, in fact, take away possession of an ounce from a misdemeanor to an infraction. We'd like to let you know also that we do have a legislative agenda as well, and that we would like to codify the Attorney General's guidelines and shore up medical marijuana and, in fact, enhance medical marijuana law and respect the federal government's leniency and respect for medical marijuana. Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Yes, my name is George Mull. I'm president of the California Cannabis Association. The California Cannabis Association is a statewide group of medical cannabis advocates, organizations, and dispensaries committed to the advancement of responsible medical cannabis regulation and to ensure qualified patients have safe and reliable access to medical cannabis across the entire state of California. We have some very serious concerns about how Proposition 19 would negatively affect medical marijuana. For example, in the purposes section, or actually for findings, that's the only place that we find any mention of medical marijuana. And the worry is that the limitations on sales that are set forth in Proposition 19 would codify the ability of cities and counties to completely restrict sales, whether to medical or otherwise. I've heard claims back from the Proposition 19 supporters that no, indeed, that Proposition 19 enshrines the protections of Proposition 215, but that's very far from the truth. After a debate that we had last week in Cal Berkeley, one of Prop 19 supporters was saying, no, indeed, the language in here enshrines it, and we were pointing out that if a city or county bans after 19, that later when this body wants to address statewide issues regulating sales, that they would not be able to, because the language in the findings section says that if a city decides not to tax or regulate, that selling cannabis within that city limit remains illegal. We have a lot of uncertainty under the law right now. I think that we do need statewide legislation. I believe that Prop 19 handcuffs this body in doing proper statewide regulation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Seth Bankel. I'm a recent law school graduate. I'm volunteer for the Yes on Proposition 19 campaign, and I wanted to say that I believe that our current laws are a failure, as we've heard extensively, and rather than talk about the morality of the use of marijuana or the quibbles legally that are coming along from the chamber, I think that we need to recognize the reality of the fact that we have millions of people that are using this drug. Our current laws just don't work, and we need new policies. We're spending money on enforcement, we're not getting money in taxes, and it's still freely available to kids. So all the goals of prohibition are not being achieved, but yet prohibition is causing many, many more problems than the drug could ever possibly do. So,
all right, thank you. Next speaker.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. My name is Jeff Jones. I'm co-proponent on Prop 19 with Richard Lee. And I think the one thing that us as proponents have been awestruck with is the raise of debate in California on this issue that has been long overdue and needed. And that this, as enunciated by many speakers before me, is a civil rights issue, and we believe is a jobs issue, and that we want California to be leading on the cusp of this and ensuring that the jobs that are currently here with the medical cannabis community are protected, as the purposes of our initiative clearly state in 7 and 8, saying that all laws related to the Health and Safety Code and to the Medical Marijuana Program Act are protected and enshrined as their different health and safety codes. A current review by the Riverside County Council says that Prop 19 does not repeal or amend any of those related statutes that currently exist. And that's what we were trying to say, is that Compassionate Use Act, SB 420, while they weren't perfect, they tried to get to grips with medical cannabis, but they were not very clear about the sale and the availability of medical cannabis in communities. And that's what Prop 19 ends. It makes sure that if a community wants to regulate medical cannabis, that it can. That if a community does not want to opt into adult use, that it can. And that a lot of the scare tactics, the disingenuous arguments that have been brought forward about cities November 3rd being able to sell adult cannabis are simply untrue. If you look at the statutory language, nobody can commercially be involved with adult use cannabis without a permit being issued by a local government, a county government, or the state government that you so represent. And I think that it just bodes well to show that half of the speakers up here in the opposition were saying that you don't have the power. You, the state government, does not have the power to collect excise taxes, to regulate this correctly. And I think that that just is just disingenuous, where the state of Colorado recently regulated medical cannabis at a state level and netted the state government in fees, permits, over $9 million. We're missing the boat when it comes to cannabis in California, and we're here to raise that debate and make sure that you can act correctly. Thank you for taking this important hearing today.
Thank you. And our last speaker.
Thank you for the hearing today. Just a couple of quick comments. One of the things that I hear universally is an agreement that we do need a policy change. I hear almost everybody agreeing that the current...
Your name, sir?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's Mauricio Garzon with the Prop 19 campaign. Okay. And just an agreement that the current policies have been incredibly problematic. They've created, through prohibition, a series of social ills of incredible proportion. And I think we're all in agreement that change is possible and should happen. What I'd like to point to is Prop 19 was drafted very carefully. It's intended to take into consideration the rights of patients, protecting children and schools, and protecting the workplace very specifically, and provide a basic framework upon which a blueprint through legislation can be enacted to make sure that the implementation is done carefully and responsibly. It's a sound and safe and responsible initiative, and I hope that you will all vote for it. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the polemic, and I think it's going to benefit California having this discussion. And again, to me, it's always been a question of public policy, and that's what we will continue to work on, given the variety of opinions. Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's been a pleasure to co-officiate this hearing with you, and I thank all the people who came to testify today. We heard a lot of different concerns, thoughts, ideas about the future of marijuana in California. What we do know is that cigarettes will kill over 400,000 Americans this year, and what we do know is that alcohol will kill over 400,000 Americans this year. We also know that marijuana will not kill anybody. The question before California voters on the November 2nd ballot is it good public policy? Is it good public health? Is it good for public safety to continue the prohibition or not? And I hope we answered some questions for people today.
Thank you, and the meeting is adjourned.